Boom. Karoline Leavitt. Ends. Jimmy Kimmel's career in one sentence. The email sat in Karoline Leavitt's inbox like a cold invitation to a battleground. The subject line was simple, direct invitation to appear on Jimmy Kimmel Live. No exclamation marks, no emojis, just words. A plain calculated invitation. She stared at it for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She wasn't going to flinch. Not today. A smile tugged at her lips, not because it was funny, but because she understood exactly what this was a trap. Jimmy Kimmel didn't invite people like her to his show out of curiosity. He invited them to mock to frame to fuel his nightly punchlines. The late-night landscape was built on ridiculing the other side, and Karoline knew that. She knew Kimmel's type. His jokes were weapons. He wanted to laugh at her, not with her. But Karoline wasn't just any guest. At 26 years old, she was sharp as a razor and fresh off a series of high-profile press briefings that had the DC press corps scrambling to contain the fallout. He thought this would be easy. The show opened as usual, light, sarcastic, and biting. The crowd warmed up to laugh at all the right places, but something shifted when her name was called. The audience didn't know how to react. They weren't sure if they should laugh or wait to see what would happen next. Then she stepped onto the stage. Her heels clicked as she walked confidently toward the chair. The applause was polite but cautious. No one knew what to expect. "Karoline welcome Kimmel," said, leaning forward in his chair ready for the easy scripted banter. "This is either very brave or very foolish." She didn't flinch. "Let's find out which," he added, and the audience laughed along, almost expecting her to crumble under the sarcasm. But Karoline didn't crumble. She tilted her head slightly, maintaining her composure. "Well, they did offer him the job," she said coolly. "He declined, said you were using all the seasoning." The crowd erupted with laughter. Kimmel chuckled, but his eyes narrowed. That wasn't supposed to happen. He quickly tried to recover. "Well, seriously, Karoline," he continued, "how do you sleep at night defending policies that are, let's say, generously controversial?" Karoline didn't look away. With a clear conscience, she said, "and a thick binder of actual facts." The subtle jab landed. Kimmel's staffers behind the camera shifted uncomfortably. Some of the audience clapped. Others sat in stunned silence. This wasn't the viral TikTok intern he was used to. This wasn't the soft-spoken assistant stumbling through answers. This was a woman who had memorized her ammo and was ready to fire back. The usual rhythm of the show was gone. Jimmy Kimmel wasn't in control anymore. She was. The conversation continued with Kimmel trying to reel her back in, but Karoline had come prepared. She didn't just want to survive the show. She was there to turn the tables, and she wasn't about to let him get away with his scripted mockery. At one point, Kimmel leaned in. "Let me guess, Karoline, you're here to tell me the media has it all wrong, that everything we say about Trump is just fake news." She smiled, unfazed. "I'm here to remind people that comedy doesn't work if you're too lazy to research the punchline." The crowd gasped. Some people clapped, others shifted nervously. The room wasn't laughing at her anymore. They were laughing with her. Kimmel tried to recover. "I do my research, thank you very much," he said, trying to regain his footing, "and it tells me that this administration has done more spinning than a soul cycle class." Karoline nodded, her response sharp. "And your writers have done more spinning than CNN after a border security speech." This time, it wasn't just the crowd that reacted. The staffers behind the cameras had gone silent. The band, which usually played Kimmel off when things got dicey, stayed still. The studio had turned into a tense battlefield. Kimmel, now realizing he wasn't in control, shifted gears. He asked a question that he thought would throw her off. "So, Karoline," he said, leaning in with an air of mock seriousness, "let's talk about January 6th. The audience perked up. The moment had arrived. Karoline didn't interrupt. She waited. She'd heard this question 1,000 times. It was a trap, but she was ready. "You still defend the guy who sent people to the Capitol?" That day, Kimmel asked, trying to corner her. She met his stare unwavering. "I defend the right of every American to be treated with the same standard of justice even when the media decides someone's guilty before the facts come out." Jimmy laughed nervously. "I think we saw the facts, Karoline. We all watched it live." She didn't flinch. "You watched the footage your producers chose," she said. "You didn't watch what was withheld. You didn't see the security footage that contradicted your headline. You didn't see the people who walked in and out peacefully, because that doesn't sell ads. Her words were calm but cutting. Kimmel shifted in his seat. The audience was silent. The tension in the room was thick. This wasn't a comedy show anymore. It was a confrontation. She continued, her voice steady. If you're going to ask questions like a prosecutor, Jimmy, at least admit that you're only showing one side of the evidence. She paused, letting her words sink in. Or is that not part of the joke? The silence was deafening. Even the crew behind the camera held their breath. Kimmel tried to recover. You know, for someone so young, you sure don't laugh a lot. Karoline smiled, but her response was sharp. I laugh, just not when people use their platform to mislead millions and call it entertainment. And just like that, the power dynamic in the room had shifted. The air in the studio grew thicker, each word Karoline spoke sending ripples of tension through the room. Jimmy Kimmel, now visibly off balance, tried to steer the conversation back towards safer ground. He had expected this to be another light-hearted back and forth, but Karoline wasn't playing by his script. You know, it's funny, Kimmel said, leaning in once again, trying to push a familiar narrative. When I talk to my audience about the administration, they don't say, wow, thank goodness for Karoline Leavitt. They say, how can someone that smart defend something that broken Karoline didn't bite? Her response was patient, composed, and utterly unshaken. I get that, she said, nodding slightly. Most people only hear your version, and when the only voice you listen to laughs at someone before they speak, it gets easy to believe the joke is the truth. The remark struck like a hammer, cutting through the air with a calmness that only made it hit harder. The audience shifted, unsure whether to laugh or reflect. Some members began to nod slightly, the realization settling in. This wasn't just a TV appearance, this was a confrontation. And Karoline was winning it without raising her voice, without theatrics, without letting Kimmel get the upper hand. Kimmel attempted to deflect his smile, growing thinner as he tried to recover. Well, he said, shifting awkwardly in his seat, let's talk about something lighter. I'm assuming you still think Trump's Twitter account should have stayed up. Karoline's expression remained unreadable as she responded. Of course, she said, her voice steady. You don't protect democracy by silencing half of it, even if he spreads misinformation. The crowd's response was immediate claps mixed with murmurs of surprise. Kimmel's face shifted. It wasn't the usual playful banter he was accustomed to, but rather a deeper, more uncomfortable conversation. He pushed again, trying to regain some sense of control. You know, Karoline, I have to ask, do you really think Trump never lies? She leaned forward, her gaze unwavering, piercing through him. I trust evidence, I trust results, and I trust that the American people can make decisions for themselves when they're given all the facts, not just the ones someone decides are acceptable. Her words were measured, precise, and yet they carried a weight that left Kimmel searching for a comeback. He laughed, but it was more forced than natural. The crowd responded, some with laughter, others with quiet contemplation. This wasn't the usual dynamic of late-night TV. Kimmel was on the back foot now. Karoline had turned the tables on him. Trying to regain the upper hand, Kimmel pushed a final question. So are you accusing me of weakening democracy? Karoline's eyes locked onto his, and her response was delivered with a calm authority that left no room for argument. I'm accusing you, she said slowly, of doing the same thing you claim to fight, pushing narratives without context and then calling it truth. Kimmel's face stiffened. For the first time during the interview, he wasn't the one with the last word. There was no quick retort, no snappy comeback. The silence between them felt like a chasm, and Karoline had just crossed it, leaving him behind. The audience, once uncertain, had now begun to react, not with the predictable laughter that Jimmy Kimmel had relied on for so many years, but with real applause. It was slow at first, one person clapping, then another. It grew a ripple of respect, of acknowledgement. Karoline had said something no one else had the courage to say, and the audience felt it. She hadn't riled them up with anger. She hadn't shouted her way into their hearts. She had simply used truth as her weapon, and truth, unfiltered and unapologetic, was landing. Kimmel, visibly flustered, tried one last attempt to shift the mood. Well, this has been educational, he said with a tight smile. But what's next for you? Planning a run for office. Karoline tilted her head slightly, her smile tight but genuine. Just telling the truth wherever that takes me. The response wasn't a victory speech. It wasn't a smug, victorious declaration. It was a quiet affirmation that she wasn't just here to survive this moment, she was here to change the conversation. And she had. The crowd's response grew louder, more genuine. The applause wasn't forced or prompted by the usual cues. It was earned. And it didn't stop there. As the interview drew to a close, Jimmy Kimmel sat in stunned silence. He had failed to control the narrative. His usual tricks, his go-to lines, the crowd's natural rhythm, none of it worked. Karoline Leavitt had walked into his arena and turned it into her own. Backstage, the tension was palpable. The producers, the crew, everyone who had watched this exchange unfold knew something had shifted. They weren't just dealing with another press secretary or politician. Karoline had proven herself as something more, a force to be reckoned with. And as she left the stage, calm and composed, her phone began buzzing. Social media was already erupting with clips from the interview dissecting every word she had said. Headlines were being written. The viral clip of Karoline saying, "You don't do comedy anymore. Jimmy, you do damage control," with a punchline was already circulating. The one-liner had become the story. In the days that followed, the ripple effect continued to grow. The interview became a case study analyzed and debated across various platforms. It wasn't just a political win. It was a cultural shift. Karoline had done something few others could. She had redefined the power of truth in a world where comedy, entertainment, and politics often blurred together. And as for Jimmy Kimmel, the following night his monologue was different. The energy was off. The audience's laughter wasn't as spontaneous. He tried to recover with his usual sarcasm, but it was too late. He had been outmatched. The whole nation had seen it. For Karoline Leavitt, this moment wasn't just about a TV appearance, it was a statement. It was about taking control of the narrative and changing the rules of engagement. And in that one moment, she had done exactly that. The next morning, Karoline woke up to her phone buzzing nonstop. Messages, notifications, and headlines flashed across the screen, a constant stream of reaction to the night before. Her interview with Jimmy Kimmel had already gone viral. Everywhere she turned, people were talking about her, what she'd said, how she'd said it, and the impact it had. The internet was abuzz. "Leavitt owns Kimmel," one headline read. "Jimmy Kimmel gets schooled live on TV," read another. The memes were flooding in her calm, sharp retorts, juxtaposed with the flustered face of Kimmel, now a laughingstock for having underestimated her. Even the most unlikely places, liberal outlets, conservative pages, and everywhere in between were buzzing about the interview. It wasn't just the press secretary's punchline, "You don't do comedy anymore. Jimmy, you do damage control," with a punchline that had captured attention. It was her delivery, her composure, and the way she flipped the narrative of the late-night TV game. Karoline Leavitt had done something rare. She had turned a hostile environment into her own stage. Her phone rang. It was her chief of staff, Megan. "Karoline, are you seeing the headlines? You're everywhere." Megan said, her voice a mixture of pride and disbelief. "You turned that interview into a win." Karoline smiled, even though she knew the storm had just begun. "I know. It feels like the tables turned before I even had to get to the punchline. You're not just trending. You're reshaping the narrative. Even the mainstream media can't ignore you now." "Do you have a plan for how we handle the fallout?" Karoline's smile faded slightly. The political world was a game of angles, and she knew this wasn't going to be a simple victory. "We'll handle it by sticking to the truth. If they want to keep pushing their narrative, they can, but they won't stop me from getting the real story out." Meanwhile, back in Hollywood, Jimmy Kimmel was navigating the aftermath of the disastrous interview. The next night, as he sat behind his desk for his monologue, there was a noticeable tension in the air. The audience was quieter than usual, and Kimmel's usual sarcasm felt forced. He tried to smile through it, but he could feel the weight of the interview hanging over him. Kimmel tried to brush it off with his opening lines, but there was no denying that something had shifted. His usual rhythm was gone. The crowd wasn't responding the way they used to. They weren't automatically laughing at his jokes. Instead, there was an awkwardness, a hesitation. In a brief moment of introspection, Kimmel paused and stared into the camera. "Some of you really liked last night's show," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "Some of you didn't. Fair enough." The admission wasn't lost on anyone in the room. He was trying to take back control, but the damage had already been done. The next morning, he received an email from his producers. "Social media is blowing up. They're saying you lost to her." Jimmy had a simple reply, "I know." Back in Washington, Karoline was preparing for what came next. The fallout from her appearance had already sparked a political wildfire. Her words weren't just echoes in the media, they were reverberating through the corridors of power. Politicians both from her own party and the opposition were reaching out, offering congratulations, raising eyebrows, and considering what this meant for the future. In the midst of this, a high-profile strategist called her. "Karoline, I've seen a lot of interviews in my time, but you did something last night that no one has been able to do for a long time, speak truth to power without blinking." She chuckled, trying to maintain her cool. "I didn't plan on making it this dramatic. You don't get to decide that," the strategist said. "The world has been waiting for someone to do this. You've made it impossible for anyone to ignore what you've said. People are listening to you in a way they weren't listening before." Karoline leaned back in her chair. "That's the point, right? We've spent too long letting others control the narrative. It's time we take it back." Her words were starting to gain more traction. She hadn't just landed a punch. She had planted a seed, and now it was growing. It wasn't about proving herself right or wrong. It was about challenging the system. At the same time, her interview had sparked more than just political conversations. Academics, journalists, and commentators were deconstructing it frame by frame. Her one-liner, "You don't do comedy anymore. Jimmy, you do damage control," with a punchline, had transcended the television screen and become a symbol of power shifting. Young conservatives embraced her message, and even independents and liberals couldn't help but admit she'd played Kimmel like a fiddle. Meanwhile, at late-night TV networks, a quiet realization was setting in. For years, late-night hosts had been able to mock the right, offer sharp commentary, and feed a liberal audience's appetite for ridicule. But now, with Karoline's performance, the tables had turned. The unspoken rules of the late-night game had been disrupted. No one had expected her to go on Kimmel's show and turn it into a real conversation. The power dynamics in late-night TV were beginning to shift. Producers in writer rooms were scrambling to rewrite their approaches to adapt to the new wave of political discourse. There was an underlying anxiety in the air. Late-night TV shows had been a space where comedians could mock and deflect, but now that space was under threat. It wasn't just Karoline Leavitt, it was a change in how the political conversation was being framed. As Karoline continued to see her name grow in prominence, the truth began to sink in. The ripple effects of her interview weren't just about her. They were about the larger conversation. In an industry dominated by humor and sensationalism, Karoline had brought the focus back to substance. She had taken control without shouting, without flailing, and without losing her composure. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Megan. "They want you on every show now." The question is, do we go on the attack or do we stick to the facts? Karoline sat quietly for a moment. "We stick to the facts," she said. "The narrative is shifting, but we can't afford to get lost in the noise. We have to stay focused." But the truth was, there was no going back now. The fight for the narrative had just begun, and Karoline had shown that she wasn't going to back down. She was in control. As Karoline Leavitt's name continued to trend across social media, the political landscape began to shift in subtle yet profound ways. The viral interview on Jimmy Kimmel's show was no longer just a moment of personal triumph. It was the spark that ignited an ongoing national debate. The narrative had changed, and people from all corners were taking notice. Back in Washington, Karoline was finding herself at the center of a storm. The phone calls flooded in. From colleagues in the White House to independent journalists, everyone had something to say. But there was an underlying tension. No one really knew how to process the impact of her words. No one had expected a young press secretary to wield such influence so effectively, to go toe-to-toe with one of the biggest names in late-night television. "You're creating a shift," a senior staffer said during one of their regular strategy calls. "You're not just influencing the media. You're reshaping the narrative around politics. People are listening to you in ways they weren't before." Karoline's response was simple. "We're not just talking to the people who already agree with us. We're talking to everyone else." Her focus remained clear. It wasn't about winning the fight in the moment. It was about shifting the public discourse, about making sure the truth came through loud and clear, no matter how uncomfortable it made people feel. While the political world digested the fallout from her appearance, Karoline's next move became the subject of intense speculation. Would she go on other shows to ride the wave of momentum? Would she engage in a full-scale political war with the late-night hosts and the mainstream media? Her approach was different. She didn't want to engage in endless back and forths or sensationalist debates. Karoline wasn't here to play the media's game, she was there to redefine it. Meanwhile, the late-night circuit had started to reevaluate itself. Jimmy Kimmel, having faced public embarrassment, was now working behind the scenes to figure out how to regain control of his narrative. His once comfortable monologue style, which had always leaned on sarcasm and sharp political jabs, had suddenly felt impotent. The way the audience had reacted to Karoline's responses was like a wake-up call. The late-night format, which had thrived for years on mocking the right and maintaining a distinct liberal edge, was no longer as effective as it had been. In the following days, reports started to surface that Kimmel's producers were reevaluating their entire approach. Kimmel, for all his experience, had miscalculated. He thought he was dealing with just another politician eager to parry his barbs. What he hadn't expected was Karoline's mastery of the conversation, her ability to turn his jokes into uncomfortable realities for him and his audience. For Karoline, the silence after the interview felt louder than anything she had said on stage. While the political world began debating her tactics, she remained calm and deliberate. The storm was only just beginning and she knew it. She had set something in motion that could not be undone. Her next move came when she was invited to appear on a high-profile Sunday news show. The invitation, like the Kimmel appearance, felt like another trap. They wanted the same spectacle, the same drama. Karoline had no intention of giving them that. As the show aired, Karoline's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the host's frantic attempts to corner her. He tried unsuccessfully to steer the conversation into partisan waters, but Karoline wouldn't bite. Instead, she turned the conversation back to substance, pointing out how the American public was fed up with the polarization of the media. What we need, she said, is less sensationalism and more responsibility. You want to fix the trust deficit in this country? Start by being honest about what's at stake, not just what sells. The host stammered, clearly caught off guard by her directness. He had expected her to become flustered, to slip into a defensive position. Instead, she was in control of the conversation. The interview ended with an awkward silence, and Karoline's statement hung in the air long after the show had finished. It didn't take long for her words to make their way back to the media. The headlines were everywhere again, but now there was a new dynamic at play. People weren't just watching her for the spectacle. They were paying attention to what she was saying, and they were listening to someone who wasn't just talking to win an argument, but to bring clarity to a conversation that had long been mired in noise. Back at the White House, Karoline's colleagues were becoming more aware of the political influence she had cultivated. Her ability to handle the media and the way she had flipped the script on Kimmel had not gone unnoticed. Some of them were even calling her the White House's secret weapon. She's rewriting the playbook, one of her colleagues remarked during a strategy session. She's been underestimated, but now she's not just answering questions, she's dictating the terms of the debate. Karoline's response was matter of fact. We don't need to keep playing by their rules. It's time to make our own. While she stayed focused on her mission, there was a sense of growing realization among the liberal media outlets that they could no longer dominate the narrative with sarcasm and mockery. The political landscape was shifting, and in many ways, Karoline Leavitt had sparked that shift. But her work wasn't done. That evening, a clip from Karoline's latest interview began circulating online. It was only a short segment, but it carried the weight of everything she had said. If we really want to heal the divide in this country, she had said, we need to start looking at the truth, not just what's easy or comfortable. We need to have the courage to face the things that hurt us instead of laughing them off. That's the real work. It wasn't just another viral moment. It was a call to action. And this time, it wasn't just her supporters who were paying attention. People across the political spectrum were starting to take her seriously. For Karoline, it was just another step forward in her plan to turn the political discourse on its head. As the media storm continued to swirl around Karoline Leavitt's interview with Jimmy Kimmel, the political landscape began to feel the ripples of change. Karoline wasn't just a press secretary anymore. She had become a force in her own right, a symbol of the power of calm, controlled dialogue in a world that thrived on sensationalism and outrage. The following week, Karoline was invited to speak at a prestigious political symposium. The event was well attended, featuring top political commentators, journalists, and media moguls. It wasn't a partisan crowd, and Karoline knew that she would be speaking to some of her harshest critics. But she also knew this was an opportunity to prove that she could handle scrutiny with grace and intelligence, just as she had done with Kimmel. When she took the stage, the room fell into a respectful silence. Karoline's presence commanded attention without the need for theatrics. She didn't need to yell or make grand gestures. Her words alone were enough to shift the energy in the room. She opened her speech with a straightforward statement. The American public doesn't want entertainment from their leaders. They want answers and they want truth. The audience was stunned by her directness. This wasn't the typical politician talking about the importance of unity or partisanship. Karoline was talking about substance, about cutting through the noise that had come to define the political discourse of late-night television and cable news. She continued, in the media, we have allowed ourselves to be distracted by headlines that sell. The real stories, the ones that affect people's lives, are buried beneath layers of spin and sensationalism. We need to make sure that the truth isn't just heard, but understood. Her words didn't just resonate with those in the room, they struck a chord with the wider public as well. Clips from the speech spread rapidly on social media, gaining millions of views. Karoline was no longer just a voice for the administration. She had become a beacon of authenticity in a media landscape that was becoming increasingly untrustworthy. By the time the event had ended, the conversation had shifted. The media outlets that had once ridiculed her were now scrambling to cover her message. The same journalists who had mocked her for going on Kimmel were now asking for interviews, eager to get a soundbite from the rising political star who had outsmarted them all. It wasn't just the press that had noticed Karoline's rise, it was her colleagues in the White House as well. Some were impressed by her ability to stand firm in the face of media attacks, while others were beginning to feel threatened by the attention she was receiving. Karoline was becoming a symbol of strength within the administration, and that power came with its own set of challenges. In the weeks that followed, Karoline found herself in more meetings, fielding requests for interviews and helping to shape the administration's narrative. But as her influence grew, so did the pressure. Every word she spoke, every appearance she made was now scrutinized by a public eager to catch her slip-up. Yet Karoline remained unshaken. She had already proven that she could stand her ground when it mattered most, and she knew that if she kept speaking the truth without fear of the backlash, she would continue to shape the political narrative on her own terms. As the weeks passed, Karoline Leavitt's stature continued to rise. Her exchange with Jimmy Kimmel had already changed the dynamic in the media and political spheres, but it was the lasting impact of her calm, calculated approach that truly set her apart. She was no longer just the youngest press secretary in history. She had become a symbol of authenticity, of standing firm in the face of media manipulation. With each new public appearance, Karoline had gained more respect from those who had once doubted her. She wasn't just defending policies anymore, she was defending a principle. The principle that truth mattered more than sound bites, that integrity could prevail in an age where information was often distorted for entertainment value. Even those who had initially criticized her were starting to come around. Political commentators who once mocked her had begun to acknowledge her composure. They realized that she wasn't simply a mouthpiece for the administration, she was a formidable force in her own right. The media, known for its hunger for scandal and drama, had underestimated her. And now they had no choice but to reckon with the reality of her influence. The more Karoline spoke, the more the media's narrative began to shift. No longer could pundits rely on mockery and distraction to deflate her. She had shown them that facts, when delivered with clarity and conviction, could carry more weight than any headline. For Karoline, however, the real victory wasn't in the headlines or the praise. It was in knowing that despite the odds, she had remained true to herself. She had used her platform not to play the game, but to redefine it. And in doing so, she had set a new standard for how political figures should engage with the public. As the year came to a close, Karoline's legacy had already begun to take shape. She had done what few thought possible. She had taken a late-night comedy show and used it as a stage to challenge the status quo. And with each passing day, her influence continued to grow, a testament to the power of truth, dignity, and unshakable resolve. The principle that truth mattered more than sound bites, that integrity could prevail in an age where information was often distorted for entertainment value. Even those who had initially criticized her were starting to come around. Political commentators who once mocked her had begun to acknowledge her composure. They realized that she wasn't simply a mouthpiece for the administration, she was a formidable force in her own right. The media, known for its hunger for scandal and drama, had underestimated her, and now they had no choice but to reckon with the reality of her influence. The more Karoline spoke, the more the media's narrative began to shift. No longer could pundits rely on mockery and distraction to deflate her. She had shown them that facts, when delivered with clarity and conviction, could carry more weight than any headline. For Karoline, however, the real victory wasn't in the headlines or the praise. It was in knowing that despite the odds, she had remained true to herself. She had used her platform not to play the game, but to redefine it. And in doing so, she had set a new standard for how political figures should engage with the public. As the year came to a close, Karoline's legacy had already begun to take shape. She had done what few thought possible. She had taken a late-night comedy show and used it as a stage to challenge the status quo. And with each passing day, her influence continued to grow, a testament to the power of truth, dignity, and unshakable resolve.